Herman H. Dinsmore, a native of the great American city of Baltimore and a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University, was employed by the New York Times for a total of 34 years, primarily in the field of foreign affairs, and has therefore been in an incomparable position both to learn what really was happening in the world and to see how those events were treated in this great institution by which he was employed. For 9 years, from 1951 to 1960, he was the editor of the international edition of the New York Times. Mr. Dinsmore was obviously committed to the ideals and principles for which the New York Times was and is supposed to stand. And he learned that instead of actually standing for that fair and impartial presentation of the news, of all the news that is fit to print, that instead of that, the paper was actually making it all the news that fits, and therefore out of the same ideals and devotion which led him to give so much of his life to that monumental paper, he now comes to tell America the truth about the greatest newspaper of record in the history of mankind, the New York Times. It is our extremely great privilege to hear from the former editor of the international edition of the New York Times, Mr. Herman H. Dinsmore.
Thank you, Mr. Evans, Colonel Bunker, and Mrs. McKinney. Ladies and gentlemen, I did not kill my father and mother just before I came here today. I didn't simply neglect to do it, nor did I put it off until tomorrow. As a matter of fact, it never occurred to me to do anything like that. I bring it up because I had breakfast this morning with Jerry Rubin. He is the man that gets paid $1,000 for each lecture to all of our better universities to tell the students to kill their parents and commit other crimes in order to fit themselves to go out and do the world's work. I have spoken before many universities over the United States in the last year, but I have never been paid a penny, and the difference is that I am a conservative. Sometimes while I was having breakfast with Mr. Rubin, I said, you know, I have not killed my parents or committed any of the crimes that you advocate or any other crimes. And he looked up and had said to me, please, not while I'm eating. Sometimes I feel that Jerry Rubin ought to have been strangled in his cradle along with Bolshevism and other of the world's impedimenta. Gary Allen informs me and us that Rubin said his communist crowd, quote, had combined youth, music, sex, drugs, and rebellion with treason, and that's a combination hard to beat. Maybe it's hard to beat, but we are going to beat it. This country did not become great after 194 years of effort merely to let communist Rubin and his crackpots destroy it. I tell you, after crisscrossing this country a half-dozen times in the last 8 months and taking a fair sample of opinion, that the people are waking up. Only the Reubens, the Fulbrights, Mansfields, Frank Churches, Goodells, Gores, and Claiborne Pells, among a few others, are sound asleep. And of course, the newspapers are not telling. They are so busy trying to create events that they forget to report them. They tried to give the British elections to the Laborites, but the people fooled them. The Laborites, the newspaper said, were going to win by 100 seats in Parliament, but they lost by 30. The newspapers were wrong by 130 seats. I contend you cannot be that wrong without design. I want to thank you all for inviting me up here from New York, because New York is a mental swamp of defeatism, disorder, and disaster. I find it significant that the orderly operation of the stock exchange and Wall Street has been saved by certain hard hats. They didn't like the permissiveness of our mayor, who is now being called our Red Mayor. He is so permissive that he believes the real American heroes of today are the young men who have fled to Canada to escape fighting for their country. Apparently, he was also going to permit the stock market to be shut. With that kind of thinking, is it any wonder that New York is in such sore plight? And the idea is being bruited about that this New York condition should be spread to the entire country by running John Lindsay for president. I am thinking that the New England Rally for God, Family, and Country should be convened more than once a year to avoid a national catastrophe. Here in old New England, one harks back to John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Quincy Adams, and others. And I know I am indebted to John and Sam Adams, among other New Englanders, for laying the early foundation for this rally. I am sure I am also indebted to a contemporary New Englander, a New Englander by adoption or adaptation. I mean Robert Welch. He brought me to this company through the John Birch Society. Some years ago, when I was a boy, it was customary for families to go to 4th of July rallies or picnics, and amid firecrackers and athletic games and much feasting on cold chicken, cold ham, deviled eggs, potato salad, and other outdoor foods, we would hear a band play national and popular music, and we would hear a speaker making a resounding patriotic speech on the history and traditions of the nation. No doubt this was not the last word in human perfection and togetherness, these 4th of July picnics, but they were a memorable step in the building of the nation. In those days, there was a fairly general unity in the country. At the time of the First World War, there were differences over the Germans or the Anglo-French forces as to which were right. Also, the socialists led by Eugene V. Debs were opposed to the war as imperialistic. But there were no serious riots or mayhem as a result of these differences. Debs was put into jail, while the Americans of German derivation proved to be excellent American soldiers in France. During the Second World War, quite a few citizens had serious reservations about how the war was permitted to start at Pearl Harbor. but I cannot remember any outbreaks of importance. Some thousands of American citizens for 3 generations, Americans of Japanese descent, were wrongfully put into camps away from the West Coast. But they took this humiliation manfully, though not without great resentment. Nonetheless, until the 1960s, this country never experienced nationwide demonstrations, riots, killings and woundings, the seizure and burning of buildings, and the pillaging of stores under the eyes of policemen told to do nothing about the crimes. The Civil War of the 1860s was a great sectional conflict, rooted in the economics of 2 regions, North and South, in which the slavery of Negroes figured as a religious, moral, and emotional factor of great importance. The present American strife is less sectional than ideological. The division is chiefly between intellectuals and the vast majority, and between the government and the people on how to fight the Vietnam War. The people want to win it. The division is between a section of the population that is being instigated by Soviet saboteurs and their professorial and journalistic helpers on one side, and innocent students, hapless shopkeepers, and an alarmed public on the other. Obviously, the mental workers, persons in colleges and universities in the arts and in the arts sciences and professions, are the chief targets of sabotage by enemies of the country. For there is no doubt in my mind that the United States of America is now engaged in a battle for its very life with other nations of the world, chiefly the Soviet government and the Chinese Communist government. The strife that we are witnessing in our country is not mere annoyance and rebellion on the part of a number of professional people and students. It is a condition that is induced by other nations, chiefly the Soviet government, with a considerable assist from Chinese communists and from American traitors who have cast their lot with Moscow or Peking, or who hope to achieve some other end by working with the Soviet Russians and or the Chinese communists. At the end of World War II, the United States had the possibility within its grasp of imposing an American peace upon the world, a Pax Americana. Only the United States with certainty had working atomic bombs and in sufficient numbers to bring about a world of American design and in the American image in regard to humanitarianism and principles of law and order. It is true that millions of pounds of atomic bomb materials were shipped to the Russians by the United States from 1943 onward. But Moscow did not even claim an atomic bomb explosion until 1949, the year in which China was finally handed over to the communists through large Russian help and large American treachery. 1949 also was just a year before the Korean War. That may be something to remember. In 1945, when American newspapers, led by the New York Times, began to turn their backs upon the rosy American prospect in foreign affairs, I asked myself whether these journals acted out of stupidity or because they did not want the United States to have the supremacy that lay within its reluctant grasp. And I was forced to conclude that the robbing of America of world hegemony was a deliberate, conscious move designed to set up a world balance of power. Over that, of course, the American authors eventually would have little or no control. In any event, America was not to have the right or the ability to control the world with little effort. Members of the Communist Party inside the United States played considerable roles in this post-war outcome. The Communist Party is virtually never mentioned in the New York Times. However, at the time, one could not be sure of the facts. You knew that things were not going right, but you could not put your finger on all the causes. I believe I may say without fear of being considered boastful that I had some knowledge of the communist practices. They never had any principles. And I came to feel soon after World War II that communists and pro-communists, with their political and other allies in the United States and many other countries, had decided to blunt the power of the United States. Many persons in America and elsewhere saw evidence of this as it was happening, and they gave voice to their discovery. But the communists and their allies in the places of power were able to keep the wool securely over the eyes of the people. Yet Americans pride themselves on their sophistication. The arguments go something like this. I'm from Missouri. Are you kidding? A conspiracy? Don't give me that. You see a communist under every bed. I've never seen a communist in my life. That's McCarthyism, the bunk. I've never seen a communist. The next thing you'll be telling me is that there were communists in the White House. You think we could win the war in Vietnam? Then why don't we do it? You mean to say you believe that we Americans have been taken in for 25 years or more? Come on. Look, I just don't see a conspiracy in my newspaper office. They're all people just like me. Why do they rewrite the stories and dispatches of reporters? Didn't they always do that? You mean to say you seriously believe that newspaper correspondents in Vietnam would do something that might endanger the lives of Americans there? Come on. Why would newspapers want the United States to lose? All right, tell me. I'll listen. Well, that's the way it goes. And now I'll try to tell you. The beliefs of the people in current affairs, domestic and foreign, are almost exclusively created by newspapers, the radio, and television. Let me give you a laboratory demonstration of how the newspapers, the radio, and television can fashion the beliefs of the people. It is a homely example, but it is most up to date because it is going on right now. It is absolutely authentic, and it extends unevenly all over the country. I will give more important examples later. This one concerns the treatment of my book, All the News That Fits, a critical analysis of the news and editorial contents of the New York Times. And the treatment of a rival book about the New York Times, a book that just happened by pure coincidence to be published simultaneously with my book, and the rival book, a whitewash, just happened to receive the greatest amount of publicity in the history of the American book publishing industry. This prompts me to say that the man who writes a book favoring the New York Times will find himself fawned upon in every newspaper, in many magazines, and in every radio and television station in the country. The man whose book attacks the New York Times will find himself without newspaper reviews, notices, or interviews, radio broadcasts, or television appearances in some areas of the country, especially New York State and practically the entire eastern seaboard. He will be shunned by some newspapers, radio stations, and television studios in cities throughout the country. This is how the beliefs of the people are fashioned. It is very simple. It is also immoral, unfair, cowardly, corrupt, and contemptible. Yet with a straight face, the very persons and publications that talk about the struggle for the minds of men are systematically engaged in capturing men's minds by distorting, omitting, or fabricating the news. This is mental warfare. It goes on steadily. A whole vast section of the American people is mentally conditioned to reject the truth in domestic and foreign affairs. The aim of news distortion is to rig the thought control processes of the nation, to mold the minds of the people to a pattern, and to block freedom of thought. To paraphrase the late great Winston Churchill, I would not want to become the editor or publisher of the New York Times only to preside over the transformation of a great newspaper into an epic deceiver of the people. Why is it necessary to write a book about and to talk about the New York Times? Because the Times affects the informational content of every literate mind in the United States and in other parts of the world. The Times sells its news and columns to 280 newspapers in this country, in Asia, Latin America, and in Europe. Recently, I was in San Bernardino in California. The leading article in the paper was a New York Times article. The leading article on page 2 was by the New York Times. The same thing is to be found in Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, Seattle, Indianapolis. You mentioned it. The Times is read by every president of the United States and by members of Congress. It is taken by every embassy in Washington and by all the embassies in New York accredited to the United Nations. It is read in every large city in this country and probably in every capital of the world, including Moscow and Peking, and maybe I should say especially Moscow and Peking. The Associated Press and the United Press International follow closely in the footsteps of the New York Times. And I mean that those news-gathering agencies follow it deliberately. America is far bigger than its newspapers. America is not going to be broken by short-sighted newspapers. How well I know this, thanks to the John Birch Society in sending me on lecture tours. In sending me on lecture tours around the country. It is a pertinent fact that the newspapers of today have produced no Ernie Pyle to glorify the American soldier in Vietnam, as Ernie Pyle glorified the American soldier in World War II. This is not an accident. The newspapers of today are more interested in damaging the character and personality of the American soldier than in glorifying him or even making him acceptable. Ernie Pyle said, "I write from the worm's eye view," and he described himself as a rabid one-man movement bent on tracking down and stamping out everybody in the world who doesn't fully appreciate the common frontline soldier. Those lines would never appear in any newspaper in New York today, and I'm afraid in no other newspapers in America. Some months ago, I received a letter from a distinguished professor at the University of California at Berkeley in which he said this, and I quote, "Systematic editorial bias of news through the conditioned minds of reflex liberals is a pathetic situation for a civilization founded on truthful principles. But the deletion of bits of news here and there is a catastrophe when, as you establish, it happens within a recurrent pattern. The communication world is not only literally sick, but it is too paranoid to face and be responsible for criticism it must understand." Close quote. Here a scholarly mind points out that the kind of professor who is quick to charge McCarthyism is incapable of accepting truth that he does not want to hear. The liberal professors with truncated minds who have overrun our universities and colleges bear a heavy responsibility for our national plight. The Berkeley professor observes that our civilization is founded on truthful principles, precisely because much of our society rests upon science, which is a body of truthful principles that cannot be tampered with. Earlier this year, I spoke to two groups of engineers of the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, and I suggested to them that they would never put a weather-observing satellite or other missile into space, nor would the United States ever have been capable of sending men to the moon if the engineer's scientific principles were arbitrarily changed and made wrong. So also, to poison the well springs of our daily news is indeed a catastrophe in our lives. It is my considered opinion that because of this, many thousands of American lives have been lost in Vietnam needlessly, and before that in Korea. Instead of winning these wars quickly and relatively painlessly, we have engaged in no-win conflicts, that is to say, limited wars with unlimited casualties. This is a perfect accommodation for the Russians and Red Chinese. I do not, of course, ascribe this to one newspaper. A number of forces and persons were involved, but the one source of compelling importance through which so much defeat has been engineered is the New York Times. You cannot blot out the truth from your newspapers because of the atomic bomb, or because the world is about to be unified, or because, as President Nixon has regretfully pointed out, some persons fear the strength of our own country. The policies of the United States government and the American press spring largely from the stated view that the United States must do nothing to embarrass the Russians, no matter how irritated and inflamed the American people may become over the everlasting wars instigated by the Soviet government. Incidentally, it may be of some interest that the New York Times almost never speaks of the Soviet government. It is always the Soviet Union. This also seems to be the Times' practice in regard to the countries of Eastern Europe. Whether this has some arcane origin of malign significance, I do not know, but I am sure there is a reason for it. The policies of the United States are officially set and announced by the government. But for many years now, they have been announced first on the editorial page of the New York Times. Even the Nixon policy of withdrawal from Vietnam was first proposed in the New York Times during the Johnson administration. Some of the New York Times' influence down the years, especially since the creation of the atomic bomb, is hard to pinpoint because errors of omission are less easily found than mistakes of commission. However, a body of literature about this is growing up, and it becomes increasingly damning. An enormous blow was dealt to the United States when a communist government was set up in Cuba, in China, also in Cuba. The power, position, and prestige of our country were further shaken by the refusal of the Truman administration to win the war in Korea, and by the eagerness with which Eisenhower consolidated this disaster by accepting a permanent truce in 1953. All of this, as we now see, was unnecessary. All appeasement is akin to dishonor, and when persisted in, leads to defeat. When the Vietnam War started for the United States 7 or 8 years ago, the New York Times threw all caution to the winds and embarked upon a reckless course of misreporting and misrepresenting events in Southeast Asia. Until then, the clearest case in which the Times collaborated with the United States government in putting a communist regime into power involved a friendly government in Cuba. This story is worth recounting because we know what happened before Fidel Castro was set up in power, and we know what happened afterward. The Times sent Herbert L. Matthews to a mountain hideout in the Sierra Maestra in Cuba in 1957 for an interview with Castro. In articles printed in the Times then, Matthews said Castro's program was democratic and therefore anti-communist, that Cuba's economy is good and most workers are contented, and there is no communism to speak of in Castro's 26th of July movement. At the same time, Castro was a communist and an agent of the Soviet government, as is now well known. Here are some hard facts that were known at the time the New York Times was publishing falsehoods in order to bring Castro to power. In 1948, Castro undertook to make a communist revolution in Bogota, Colombia. 10,000 persons were killed in a few days in that revolt, deftly engineered by communists acting upon the direction of Soviet agents in a conspiracy that was worked out in Havana, chiefly in the Soviet embassy there. United States diplomats were well aware of Castro's participation in that terrible uprising, and they did all they could to alert the United States government, but they were rejected by those in the State Department and other areas of the government who were determined to set up a communist regime in Cuba. Castro's role in the Bogota revolt was to help bring about the assassination of Jorge Gaitan, liberal leader who was revered by the Colombian masses. The Soviet authors of this Holocaust believed, and they believed rightly, that the murder of Gaitan would touch off a wild display of hysteria that could be channeled into the burning of buildings and the killing of conservatives or anyone considered hostile to the revolutionaries. Observe the similarity to the burnings in 125 American cities immediately after the murder of Martin Luther King. If the assassination of President Kennedy by a communist was designed to start a similar series of conflagrations in the United States, the action failed. But the communists undoubtedly have scored successes with provocations of that kind on American college and university campuses. As to Castro, well-documented police records, the testimony of ambassadors, newspaper stories printed in Latin America, if not in the United States, and other relevant data attest to the following information. Castro and other Cuban communists met the Colombian assassin the day before he was to perpetrate the murder of Gaitan, and they promised the man that they would rescue him from any mobs after he had killed the liberal leader. Instead, Castro and his co-conspirator sat in a car and watched the murder. Then they killed the murderer by turning machine guns on him. This is a typical Stalinist murder method. The killer is slain immediately or soon after he commits the scheduled murder. It is less well known in America that the communists deliberately engineer vast popular outbreaks through murders of well-known persons, or they may be persons unknown to the public, but persons whose death would have an electrifying effect upon a nation. For instance, students. The liberal-conservative feud in Colombia that followed the slaying of Gaitan by communists, instigated by the Soviet government, is said to have resulted in the killing of more than 200,000 Colombians over the years until both sides agreed to a truce. As you see, I make no distinction between the Communist Party of the USSR and the Soviet government itself. In fact, they are indistinguishable. The assassination school maintained in Minsk is operated by the Soviet government. In a totalitarian regime, the one political party and the one administration are inseparable. Elections are made easy for the voters. He has neither a choice nor an echo. On the other hand, he must vote Da. Incidentally, I assume that the Soviet assassination squads operate chiefly outside of the Soviet Union and the Soviet government. I also assume that any assumption about the Soviet government can be incorrect. After the assassination of Gaitan, Castro joined in the looting of stores. It is impossible that all these facts and many more would not have been known to those persons at the New York Times who were assigned to cover events in Cuba. But the Times does not plead ignorance. In this episode of American foreign relations, the close link between the New York Times and the State Department was shown again by the fact that ingoing Ambassador Earl E.T. Smith in 1959 was ordered to be briefed by Herbert L. Matthews. But Matthews was not a member of the State Department. He was on the editorial board of the New York Times. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot have freedom of the press and a working tie of that sort with the government. Matthews, that is the New York Times, was committed to putting Castro into power. Ambassador Smith was not impressed by Matthews' views, but that did not prevent the communists from taking over Cuba, because the government of President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was determined to put Castro into power. Anyone who gives even a cursory glance at the facts here must reach this conclusion. Once again, the mistake that was made was not in favor of the United States. And for the horrible enormity of this mistake, let us look at the results of Castro's coming to power. First, about 1/10 of the people of Cuba, 760,000 persons, have been forced into exile, chiefly in the United States. This is said to be the greatest mass migration in the history of the Western Hemisphere. We think of the exodus of 200,000 Hungarians in 1956 and the shipping of 50,000 Hungarian boys to Siberia at the same time as appalling, as indeed these actions were. None of the 50,000 Hungarian youths, incidentally, ever was returned. Yet here on our doorstep, nearly 1 million persons are thrust out of their country, minus their possessions. Can anyone doubt that Moscow was the source of this cruelty? Second, thousands of persons have been killed by the Castro regime. A foreign diplomat in Cuba has put the number of those executed by firing squads up to April of 1969 at 20,161, and the additional number who died of torture at 2,320. By now, the total figure must be around 25,000, since Castro was reported to be stepping up executions during the last year because of unrest, meaning hatred of his regime. The bloody reign of terror in Cuba loses little by comparison with that of the French Revolution. The difference is that the French reign of terror has been given a vast amount of publicity. The communist Cuban outrages have had almost none. We have a Holocaust and a human abattoir on our doorstep. When Herbert L. Matthews was asked, after Castro had executed 550 Cubans, what he thought of Castro's conduct, he replied that Castro was simply sowing his wild oats. It is of such a frivolous and foolish attitude that a great potential disaster for the United States has been put together. The third result is that the first atomic war showdown in the history of the world came about between the United States government and the Soviet government in 1962, when the Russians had placed in Cuba missiles with atomic warheads pointed at the United States. I read in the New York Herald Tribune, but not in the New York Times sometime afterward, that Khrushchev had written a cringing, crawling letter to President Kennedy urging him not to throw atomic bombs on Russia. Fourth, the Russians are in fact in control of Cuba. They have tunneled the island from one end to the other. They operate submarine pens in Cuba, and they land people on our shores in these submarines. They have MiG fighter planes there. The New York World Telegram, but not the New York Times, reported that one of the MiG planes flew over South Carolina a few years ago. Cuba is now a Soviet-occupied land and a permanent menace to the United States and to all of the Americas. Fifth, Cuba has been the scene of a terrible American military fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. The great nation that could stage and carry out the invasion of Europe in 1944 could not bring off a landing in Cuba. Sixth, more than $3 billion worth of American property has been seized by the communists without any kind of compensation. Seventh, Cuba now is the seat of training for guerrillas, communist guerrillas. Chinese communists sit side by side with Russian communists in Havana, and there too sit American communists who plot revolt burnings, and lootings in the United States and other countries of the Americas. Yet communist Cuba has a seat in the United Nations and an embassy in New York City, where the so-called diplomats engage in hostile actions against the United States on our own soil. The sooner we can get the United Nations, a huge communist Trojan horse on the left bank of the East River, the sooner we can get this Soviet base out of the United States. The sooner we can get this base out of the United States, the better off we will be. Brigadier General Rothwell Hutton Brown, a West Point graduate, a fine old warrior, and a friend of mine, recently wrote that President Kennedy's refusal to insist upon inspections has left us quite unknowing of just how many missiles have been introduced surreptitiously into Cuba. We'll probably never know, General Brown believes, until they start destroying our cities in the south and along the eastern seaboard. If that sounds lurid, just remember that the city of Washington was burned down during the War of 1812. When I have said this before a college audience, there are always some who laugh. None are so ignorant and contumacious as the militant minority in our universities today. The dangerous features that I have described as a once good neighbor, Cuba, the Cuba of Batista, are the legacy of our government, the New York Times, and other sections of the American press to the American people. No one can be in the shadow of a doubt that the Times deliberately misled the people on Cuba. For even if we assume that the Times merely erred at first, it has had 10 years in which to correct its mistake, but it has never done so. The New York Times insists even today that the United States recognize the criminal communist Cuban regime and do business with it. The establishing of this bloodthirsty government just off the shores of the United States is one of the best examples one can give of how dishonest, untruthful, fabricated news causes the loss of lives. The United States government had to have the cover of the New York Times falsehoods in order to put Castro into power. And later General Eisenhower took refuge in the misstatements of Matthews in order to exculpate the Eisenhower administration. But the American people did not elect the New York Times to run the country and make its foreign policy. They elected President Eisenhower. I am personally glad to have the support of President Nixon and Vice President Agnew in helping to expose. I'm glad to have their help in helping to expose the grave shortcomings of the communications media. On April 30th last, President Nixon said that other presidents had made more notable decisions than his decision to send American troops into Cambodia. Then Mr. Nixon added these words, "But between those decisions of other presidents and this decision to enter Cambodia, there is a difference that is very fundamental. In those decisions, the American people were not assailed by counsels of doubt and defeat from some of the most widely known opinion leaders of the nation." Close quote. That covers the New York Times, among other opinion leaders in the nation. Previously, Vice President Agnew had been specific in naming the New York Times when he said that the day when the network commentators and even gentlemen of the New York Times enjoyed a form of diplomatic immunity from comment and criticism of what they said, that day is over, I hope. At least I'm doing my share of criticizing. It is good to know that the administration is divorcing itself from nationwide sources of misinformation, non-information, and plain fabrication. Let us hope that this is a start toward much greater things. Recently, a knowledgeable young man said to me that he did not feel that I could blame the New York Times for setting up a communist Cuba. I told him that I believed the government in Washington first of all. that I blamed the government in Washington first of all. But I asked him if he believed that Castro would have gained power if the New York Times had vigorously opposed him. And I think the answer is no. Neither would we have a communist-dominated Eastern Europe or a communist China, probably, if the New York Times had exerted itself to prevent them. Because the Times is more than just a newspaper. It is the mouthpiece for some of the most powerful interests in the United States: industrial, commercial, financial, and cultural. That, unfortunately, is not a flattering commentary on those powerful interests. Ask yourself how the United States could have suffered more than 300,000 casualties in Vietnam without winning, unless these powerful interests had collaborated in this mammoth scandal. I know that there are honorable exceptions. Recently, a former vice president of one of the world's largest corporations stopped me on the street and, without any solicitation on my part, deplored the policies of the New York Times. On the other hand, a working vice president of a large corporation has stopped speaking to me. Another corporation vice president finds my views awfully amusing. Yet one more vice president adopts some of my views, but thanks another author. Again, on the subject of Cuba, a fraud has been committed upon the people, and first of all, the people of Cuba. Our collective and national guilt for that is forgotten. A fraud has also been perpetrated upon the people of the United States and the people of the world, because every time another country is sacrificed to the great Moloch of communism, another nail is driven into the coffin of world freedom. At about the time of Castro's takeover in Havana, I began to have the profound worries that led me to discover what was making the New York Times and its satellite newspapers in America follow a course that was consistently adding to the strength of the Soviet government. The only theory that could make sense to me was that much of the press, but especially the Times, had decided to seek a world balance of power. This meant something that was repugnant to me, because it meant playing off another power or other powers against the United States. This untenable position means that much of the press takes a neutral position as between the United States and the Soviet Union. But in the case of the New York Times, it actually favors the Russians and their allies over the United States, except in the Middle East in time of hot crisis. Now it is my belief and my assertion that this attitude of seeking a balance of power has resulted in some of the strangest twists and turns ever seen in the American press. Actually, it is not a balance that is sought. Actually, the aim is to pit others against the United States and to downgrade our own country and its soldiers and its people. The New York Times has been at great pains to show that it is not merely opposed to the Vietnam War, not all war, but merely the Vietnam War or any other war of its choice. It also opposes victory, but specifically victory for the United States. This, of course, plays right into the hands of the enemy. We have to realize that there are powerful persons among us who want to play communists off against conservatives, totalitarians against Democrats or Republicans, Negroes against whites, Northerners against Southerners, youths against their elders, intellectuals against ordinary folk, West Europeans against East Europeans, the Soviet government against the United States, the United Nations against useful alliances, Communist Cuba against the Americas, Nigeria against Biafra, now vanquished, and the Congo against Chumbe, now dead. This is all part of the swinging balance of power. This is indeed the work of insiders, because neither the American people nor any other people would thus work against themselves. Here are a number of examples of positions that the New York Times has taken. And let me first give you an example in reverse of the Times policy. When Armstrong and Aldrin were about to become the first men in the history of mankind to set foot on the moon, the White House announced that President Nixon would speak by radio to the spacemen for a few minutes after the lunar landing. The New York Times immediately went into a dither and produced on July 19, 1969, an editorial entitled "Nixoning the Moon." And it said this: apart from objections on grounds of taste, I don't know how taste could extend from New York to the moon, there is another and more basic objection to this proposal. The time allowed by NASA for astronaut activity on the moon is extremely limited, less than 2.5 hours, and is already so crowded with assigned tasks that the full schedule of scientific activities may not be realizable. The President would cut still further into this extremely precious time with an unnecessary conversation. Such an intrusion looks suspiciously like a publicity stunt of the type Khrushchev used to indulge in. This is still the Times speaking. It strikes us as unworthy of the President of the United States, close quote. This editorial seeks to give the illusion of a high-minded appeal to the chief executive of our country to refrain from interfering with the collecting of geological specimens on the moon. But it betrays its malice by dragging in Khrushchev for a comparison with the President's proposed 3-minute conversation with a spaceman. Of course, Mr. Nixon ignored the editorial, and all Americans whom I talked to or heard of were proud that he spoke to Armstrong and Aldrin on July 21st, 1969, as they stood on the moon. I personally was delighted, even chauvinistically delighted, perhaps even jingoistically delighted over this American victory, even though we had to get off the earth to have the victory. And of course, I was not really put out over the President's victory over the New York Times. The Khrushchev angle nettled me, and I got to thinking about what the Times would have done if the Russians had arrived on the moon ahead of American men. I know Mr. Bedford Evans would say no possibility of that whatever. Anyhow, they didn't do it. Would the New York Times have had an editorial entitled "Brezhneving the Moon"? Would the Times have warned Mr. Brezhnev against trying to share the stage with the Russian astronauts as rather unseemly and in bad taste? And would the Times have complained to Mr. Brezhnev on the grounds that the Russian spacemen were envoys of all mankind who should be allowed to dig holes and bag moon rocks without molestation by the leader of all the Russians? No. That is not the way the balance of power works. Criticism of that sort is made only against an American president, never against the Soviet leader. And I cannot begin to tell you how much this attitude has affected the coverage and presentation of news and editorials in our newspapers and on our radios and television screens. The American people have been duped and deceived on a scale never dreamed of before in all of our history. Here are some other examples. During the 1950s, the late Ho Chi Minh ordered the farmers of North Vietnam collectivized. When they resisted, the communist dictator killed 50,000 of them, and he caused 100,000 others to be put into concentration camps. This is normal procedure under totalitarianism. Hence, the New York Times virtually ignored it. I doubt that you will find this fiendish action indexed in the Times. Repression in a communist state is not considered to be a fair field for news coverage. It might embarrass the communists. But if the late President Diem or the present President Thieu of South Vietnam killed 50,000 farmers, and put 100,000 into concentration camps, the news would receive 8-column streamer headlines on page 1 of the New York Times. That's the way it works. Here are other examples that come even closer to home, and remember that these practices are copied from or purchased from the Times by newspapers all over our country. For years during the war, the Times printed picture after picture of South Vietnamese mothers carrying wounded children. The picture captions said the children had been wounded by American soldiers, airmen, or Marines. There were no pictures of scores of thousands of atrocities deliberately committed by North Vietnamese on orders of the Hanoi government. This was a studied, systematic policy of the Times. And this kind of omission has resulted in an enormous distortion of the events of the war, so much so that it can fairly be said that the whole situation has been fabricated. In real truth, the Americans and their allies have been treated and are being treated as enemies by a great American newspaper and its tributary press all over the country and beyond. A brief refusal by an American Company A was characterized as a mutiny and given big front-page play under a 4-column picture, while the daily fighting news was put on inside pages. There were virtually no stories of heroic and gallant American actions on the battlefield or in the villages in helping the South Vietnamese civilians, though thousands of such stories were easily available. Also, books that appraised the Americans in Vietnam were not reviewed in the New York Times and are not reviewed in the New York Times, while books that denounce the war are always sure to find a place in the daily and Sunday book sections. It is time to wake up and call a halt to this. One of the most remarkable illustrations or examples of the New York Times' efforts to fabricate situations in Vietnam has been the attempt to make American soldiers appear to be no better than the North Vietnamese specialists in mass murder. This concerns the My Lai case. The Times gave columns and even pages of space to the charge that American soldiers entered the village of My Lai and killed at least 109 civilians. By indirection, the practices of the Nazis were dragged into the coverage of this case, as if somehow the Americans could be related to the systematic Hitler government-ordered massacre of millions of Jews and others in gas chambers during World War II. One United States Marine who had been accused of massacring South Vietnamese civilians was acquitted about a week ago when the evidence showed that he had not only not fired on civilians, but he had never fired on the enemy. Of course, as long as the Americans are kept under the cloud of having committed a massacre in South Vietnam, just so long will the real culprits, the North Vietnamese communists and their Russian and Chinese communist instigators, be relieved of charges of systematically massacring South Vietnamese civilians, which they do. And that, I believe, keeping the heat on the Americans, is the real aim of the charges against the Americans. No wonder this war has not produced an Ernie Pyle. I say that this is literally a hell of a way to conduct foreign affairs and run a war. It is also a hell of a way to run a newspaper. The New York Times continues to do nothing to center the attention of the people upon the savage nature of the North Vietnamese communists. The Times made nothing of the killing of 5,800 South Vietnamese civilians at the city of Hue, many of them buried alive with their heads protruding, during the enemy Tet Offensive in 1968. Nor did the Times bestir itself to put the spotlight upon the slaughter of civilians in Biafra through famine. And at one time, the Times charged the Biafrans with propaganda when hundreds of thousands of their people were dying and did die. By coincidence, the Russians were helping Nigeria against Biafra. When I returned to New York from a tour of California, Oregon, and Washington in November, I found an atmosphere of defeatism in New York that was sickening, and I experienced it again in April of this year when I got back from San Francisco. The Times, in virtual control of the information channels in New York, was playing up the alleged My Lai massacre as it would have sensationalized a victory in World War II. Actually, I believe the Times felt that here at last was the ploy that would defeat the Allies in Vietnam. Even the dullest person could see that the Times was trying to downgrade the Americans and brand them as no better than the enemy. Unfortunately for the Times, and fortunately for America, the people saw through this maneuver and it backfired. Let us hope the government will get around to dropping this entire case. When the My Lai matter first arose, I detected a red herring, and I decided I would try to learn the origin of these charges and the reasons for the big newspaper play. Luckily, there are many Americans on the lookout for this kind of thing, and one of them is maybe here among us, but he's one of the speakers, and he is Dan Smoot. Dan Smoot did two of his reports on this case called Pinkville Part 1 and Pinkville Part 2. Because of the great importance of your knowing how this kind of thing is worked up for our left-wing press by the left wing in American politics, I want to read to you a few paragraphs from the first Dan Smoot report, and here it is. In October 1969, Seymour M. Hersh, a freelance writer in Washington, D.C., heard of the case. That is the My Lai case. Hersh obtained a $1,000 grant from the Philip M. Stern Foundation for Investigative Journalism and started flying around the country looking for bits of information. Through a syndicating service that he organized, the Dispatch News Service, Hersh broke the My Lai story nationally by selling it to 32 newspapers for release on November 12th last. For doing the maximum damage to the American armed forces in particular, and to the nation in general, Hersh's My Lai massacre story was perfectly timed. It made banner headlines all over the world just 2 days before the communist-directed anti-American moratorium demonstrations in Washington on November 15, 1969. Hersh is closely tied in with a new left political movement which for years has demonstrated and agitated for a communist victory in Vietnam. He was, for example, a speechwriter for Senator Eugene McCarthy last year. He has been associated with Abby Hoffman and David Dellinger, two pro-communist new leftists, close quote. Well, that is how it is done. Somebody gives the signal to the press, and somebody gets the signal there. News is tailored to order. Incredibly, absolutely incredibly, this piece of story peddling by Seymour M. Hersh caused him to receive this spring a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. That gives you some idea of the worth or worthlessness of a Pulitzer Prize in journalism. Incidentally, a book by Mr. Hersh called My Lai, the Massacre, not the alleged massacre, mind you, but the massacre, no trial has been taken place yet, was published simultaneously with the award of the so-called prize. His book was instantaneously on sale in New York at bookstores that either never stocked my book at all or did it only under prodding after months after the publication, and then did everything possible not to sell it. such as putting all the news that fits on a high rear shelf where only a mountain goat could reach it after observing it through a telescope. If America would accept defeat in Vietnam as the only way out, as a small minority of leftist students wish, then the territory of the United States would be made safe for draft dodgers and opponents of the war, but it would not be safe for anybody else. Students must not be permitted to make the foreign policy of the United States or to control any of its domestic policies. The idea that the United States cannot win is fantastic. We are asked to believe that the nation that led the entire free world to victory in World War II cannot defeat a small nation without raiding in Jane's fighting ships or other military manuals. The truth is that our forces have been fighting with less than half of their strategical weapons, and I do not mean atomic bombs. What is more, when in earlier years of the war the United States was bombing the North, not all of the targets, and some say not 1/10 of the targets selected by the military leaders, were approved by Robert S. McNamara, President Johnson's defense secretary. I have heard other entirely believable stories that in some cases our soldiers have been ordered to fire over the heads of the enemy, while others have been denied permission to load their guns until given the order to fire. This would practically guarantee casualties on our side. What has been behind this truly crazy way of fighting a war? Why would a president send 550,000 Americans to a faraway land and not let them fight to win? Then why have we been in Vietnam at all? Just to be killed or wounded, never to win? The question was never answered by the Johnson administration. Now it seems to me that President Nixon went some distance toward answering that question in his speech of April 30th last. Then he said this, and I quote, "If we fail to meet this challenge, all other nations will be on notice that despite its overwhelming power, the United States, when a real crisis comes, will be found wanting. We will not be humiliated. We will not be defeated. We will not allow American men by the thousands to be killed by an enemy from a privileged sanctuary." Close quote. This indefensible practice had been going on for years. The president said he would rather be a one-term president than see America become a second-rate power or see this nation accept the first defeat in its proud 190-year history. At the same time, the president put an end to the policy of not bombing the North, no matter how many casualties the Americans and their allies sustained as a result of that foolish policy. Incredibly, the North Vietnamese threatened to break off the so-called peace negotiations in Paris. They have done nothing but make a mockery of those talks. If they broke them off, they would be doing us a favor. After all, we have been fighting wars with the communists now for 25 years. But in all those years, our government has never taken the initiative. We have always been on the defensive, at home and abroad, while some Americans have taken the initiative on behalf of other governments. Now Mr. Nixon actually uses the word victory, a word that the New York Times and its clients abhor and reject as odious and fearsome. Mr. Agnew, incidentally, went all over Southeast Asia saying that we intend to win in Vietnam. The president's move in Cambodia was an appropriate response to the endless intransigence and slaughter by an implacable enemy. Unfortunately, the outcry against his merciful move to save American and Allied lives did not help the president or the country. The same old minority crowd of communist-oriented students, defeatist newspapers, and whining senators brought about a measure of retreat. If Mr. Nixon could now go ahead and threaten to halt trade with the nations that send weapons and strategical materials to North Vietnam, And if he would blockade the port of Haiphong, the Vietnam War would collapse, and a positive policy of dealing with the enemies of the United States and the rest of the free world would have been embarked upon. It is a strange fact that the press has not been very eager to tot up the losses of the enemy or to give any encouragement that we might win this war and prevent the world from being cut in two in Southeast Asia. In this connection, I very much want to read you some words that Mr. Nixon wrote in 1964. On the fate of South Vietnam depends the fate of Asia, for South Vietnam is the dam and the river. The communist conquest of Southeast Asia would draw a boundary line from pole to pole. Overnight, the United States would cease to be a power in the world's greatest ocean. Our ships and planes could thereafter circumnavigate the globe only with communist permission. Can anyone doubt that long before this happened, the United States would have become involved in a major war, if not a world war? Well, I want to give you these figures on how the enemy has suffered. Recently, I asked the Defense Department for the figures on the enemy dead. In 1968, they reported as 181,000. If we use the multiple of 4 to get the number of wounded, and that is conservative because the American multiple for wounded is closer to 7, and the Americans have greater firepower, the total enemy casualties in 1968 were 905,000, and in 1969 they were 784,000. And from 1961 they would be around 3 million. North Vietnam is a country of about 20 million persons. As General Earl Wheeler has said, the Americans in Vietnam are unbeaten and unbeatable. The great effort being made in the United States and in some other countries to make the Americans get out of Vietnam and lose the war now is a measure of the nearness of the American success in winning the war so far, in spite of all the impediments that have been put up against the soldiers. This will surprise no one so much as the readers of American newspapers. A great combined campaign, national and international, to gain a world government through the United Nations is being made. This is the background of many little understood actions in the field of journalism, newspapers, magazines, books, and other media. Facts are being omitted, distorted, and fabricated to bring about a desired end. It may not be the desired aim of the Republic, but that does not matter. I have given here the merest sampling of these derelictions. A large number of the units of the media are engaged in a conspiracy, tacit or otherwise. No doubt there have always been conspiracies, but the one confronting us now is of the most critical importance in our lives. To pursue a vacuum or falsehoods as a way of life is surely a fatal way. We must make every effort to change this. Because of the international or global nature, perhaps even cosmic nature of our problem, I suggest that completion of the winning of the war in Vietnam be the first step. Students at our universities cannot be permitted to decide foreign policy no matter what university chancellor, vice chancellor, or professor urges them on. Students in Russia do not riot, much less do they make foreign policy. They do not seize or burn buildings. They do not picket their secret police headquarters for harassing murderers. They do not have a Students for a Democratic Society in Russia. There is no permissiveness in the Soviet Union or government or schools. Soviet firemen are not attacked when they go to put out fires. Stores are not looted. There's not much in them, but they're not looted. All of these things are what the Russians helped to do to the United States. There are no United Nations meetings in Russia. There are no parades of homosexuals on Gorky Street through the Central Park of Culture and Rest in Moscow. we have been going to our destruction down a one-way street. George Washington in 1776 said, "Our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us only the choice of a brave resistance or the most abject submission. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or to die," quote, unquote. The struggle in America and of America is one that concerns freedom, a priceless heritage handed down to us by fighters like George Washington, not draft dodgers or slackers. Centuries of life lie ahead for our children and their children. Have Americans hacked their way to fame and fortune only to be taken over by indolent, arrogant, mafioso-like characters in Eastern Europe and Asia? It is something that must be acted on. I would urge you all to read my book to get a greater understanding of what is being made to pervert or poison your minds against your country and against yourselves. I myself joined the John Birch Society in March of this year because I felt it was the most effective, non-political, non-denominational, anti-communist organization covering all of the United States. This society has no military or paramilitary functions. Its only work is to inform. It is not extremist. It commits no burnings or lootings or other kind of violence. Naturally, such a peace-loving group is frowned upon by the Black Panthers, the New York Times, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and other such organizations and persons. The same newspapers that have poisoned the news have also put a great smear on the John Birch Society. So that in New York today, if you say John Birch Society to a person, he will disintegrate before your eyes. I have done all I could to draw the United States out into an open and fair fight. They prefer guerrilla warfare, the whisper, and the knife. Your presence here shows you have already become involved in this ultimate struggle between the forces of evil and the normal development of the free world in freedom. The sole aim of the Soviet government and the Chinese Communist government in fostering the war in Vietnam is to weaken the United States, to divide it, and eventually to rule the world. The Russians have not the faintest scintilla of interest in the lives of Vietnamese, North or South, nor have the Chinese Reds. The communists, by definition, care nothing for lives. Their aim is power. They are a world mafia with a philosophy, Marxism. The United States is the world base and bastion of freedom. If freedom is lost here, we shall have totalitarianism, darkness, treachery, ignorance, and atavism for 1,000 years. Thank you.